Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Russell Matthews here, and this pandemic has been the best thing to ever happen to Canadians and their money. Or at least that's what some Canadians are thinking right now. Let me explain. This chart tracks just how much Canadians have been able to save as a portion of their income over the past 60 years. And I'm sure one thing will stand out to you, and that's this huge spike right here as we start to see results coming in from this pandemic. Whereas for the past 20 years or so, it's hovered in that 3 to 5% range. Now we're seeing it spike all the way up to above 25%, pushing 30% of income saved by an average Canadian. If you're like me, you'll be a little bit confused by these numbers because I've constantly been hearing on the news so many people are stretched so thin and are paycheck to paycheck, and we're in one of the worst economic downturns of the past 100 years because of the pandemic. Why are Canadians able to save a lot more, or at least why does this data say this? Well, in today's video, we're going to talk about how some Canadian households are sitting on a total of $90 billion of extra cash, while other Canadian households who are more struck by this pandemic are suffering. It seems that some government benefits that have been handed out to Canadians and to Canadian businesses have been used in ways other than they were initially intended, and this could account for a lot of this increase in cash. But before we get too deep into it, if you're new to the channel, hey, how's it going? It's nice to meet you. My name is Russell, and on this channel I post videos about Canadians and their money with the overall goal of bringing information to Canadians as quickly and accurately as possible so that they can set themselves up for a more wealthy future. If that sounds interesting to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because I'm coming out with updates like this all the time, and you're bound to learn something that could help you in your family's future. All right, with that said, let's get into this and find out which Canadians are benefiting from this pandemic and contributing to these stats of increased household savings. Last week, CIBC put out this report that talked about just how much cash Canadian companies and Canadian households are sitting on in the midst of this pandemic, and it resulted in headlines like this. CIBC says Canadians are sitting on $170 billion of excess cash. That's a lot of money. And like I said before, this is a little bit confusing, right? We've seen the Canadian government implement these new benefits like the CRB, the CRCB, CRSB to help Canadians just stand on their feet and stay afloat amid this crazy financial crisis, right? We've seen so many people lose jobs, employment numbers have been up, and you would expect that Canadians would have less savings now than before. So I did a little bit of digging for you because I wanted to let you know what group of Canadians were the ones that were actually hoarding all this cash and what businesses were holding this cash and why were they doing it and how were they able to. So I found this interview, and it's with Benjamin Tal, and he's one of the economists at CIBC who actually helped to put together this study, and it seems like he might have some of the answers. So we're going to take a look at this interview that he did with the BNN Bloomberg, which is a business and financial news network in Canada, and we're going to see what answers he has to these questions. First, let's see what he has to say about this increase in household savings rates and how Canadians are sitting on $80 billion or even $90 billion of extra income in some Canadian households. Let's see what he has to say.
We are seeing a situation in which, and we all know that, the savings rate is going up, spending went down dramatically, but income actually went up because of government support and the fact that many people did not see their income going down. So we are in a very weird situation in which the economy is down, but the level of cash in the economy is rising, especially held by households. Roughly $90 billion of extra cash sitting on the sidelines looking for direction. And this is really, really important because at one point, this money will be redeployed into the economy. And the question is, what does it mean in terms of consumer spending? We don't know exactly what will happen and when. I suspect it will not happen anytime soon, especially not during the winter. But after the winter, especially following your discussion regarding a vaccine, when you see the light, maybe this will be the green light for people to actually start redeploying this mountain of cash they're sitting on.
That's a little bit interesting right there. The interesting point that he makes here is that while the economy is down overall, people's savings and their personal deposits into their bank accounts has gone up. Now, this points to the fact that there are Canadians out there who have been less affected by this pandemic, but have been able to receive the same supports from the government, the CERB or the CRB. They've been able to receive those despite the fact that they're not struggling as much as the people who these programs were initially focused on. For example, based on my knowledge, if you were somebody who was making a ton of money last year, like say you were making over $200,000, but for whatever reason, your business had to stop and sort of pause for a time at the beginning of the pandemic, you were still able to collect that CERB money, even though technically you should have a ton of money saved up that you can live on. But as long as you weren't personally making over $1,000, you're able to claim the CERB. And it's a little bit different for CRB as well, because all you need to do is show that there's been a reduction of 50% of your income when compared to last year, which is pretty easy to do if you had these huge sales in the previous year. So these people who you would expect to have these savings saved up and ready to spend in a situation like this, like a pandemic, they're also receiving these benefits as well, and that could point to increased savings on an overall rate for Canada. And the other aspect that sort of stacks on top of that is the mortgage deferral program. So we all know that Canadian house prices have gotten pretty high and that most people who own a home are doing pretty well financially, right? Well, we saw that whole period where they had mortgage deferrals happening and these homeowners were able to pause their mortgage payments and then potentially receive these benefits at the same time. So they didn't have to pay for rent, didn't have to pay for their mortgages, and could receive the benefits. So potentially they could have saved the entirety of that $14,000 from CERB. Let's see if Benjamin Tal in this interview touches on this a little bit more.
Yes, we know that most of the decline in spending was among high-income households in Canada and in the US. So they are the ones that really cut their spending because low income spend most of their income, government or their income, on necessities. So that's not the issue. The issue is high income. So it will be all kinds of goodies that they really didn't spend on during the recession, during the pandemic. All this pent-up demand for vacations, for all kinds of other things will be utilized using that cash.
Okay, so that's a couple interesting points as well. The main takeaway from this section is that he's saying that people who were on a low income before the whole pandemic hit, they were required to spend the money that they got as a benefit or any income they had just to make ends meet and just to live on their day to day. And that money was, as a result, put back into the economy, which is a good thing overall for the economy. But people who are wealthy and had savings, when a pandemic or an emergency hits like this, there's generally a tightening of the belts of these families. And they think, okay, maybe I'm not going to splurge on that new car. Maybe I'm not going to splurge on this fancy vacation, which I guess you couldn't take at all because of the pandemic. But you see what I'm getting at. Not only does the money that's gone to some of the wealthier Canadians not make the most sense in terms of where that money's deployed, like shouldn't that money be given to people who are really struggling? Well, it doesn't make sense on that front, but also it doesn't make sense because the wealthy families are less likely to spend that money, put it back into the economy, create a better cycle for businesses, and as a result, potentially increase the amount of jobs that are available for Canadians. So you can see how this sort of stagnates our recovery from the pandemic as a whole.
And now let's talk about businesses, because they're also sitting on excess cash, which you really don't want to see, right? We want to encourage businesses to be investing in that. Why so much excess cash on business balance sheets?
That's a good question. So again, I think that a lot of this cash is held by companies and sectors that are not impacted directly by the crisis. In fact, they are benefiting from it. At the same time, they are not in a mood to invest when the economy is down. So they are sitting on this cash, waiting, looking for direction. And this cash will be utilized the minute they see the light, because it's really suboptimal for them to sit on this cash and not to invest. Another factor, and that's interesting, remember CEBA? You remember this $40,000 of lending to businesses? I suspect that many of them basically took this as insurance. So you know what, let's have it, see what happens, so then collect the $10,000, which is, 25% is forgivable, and then return it. I suspect that out of the $32 billion of CEBA money, some of it is sitting in checking savings accounts in corporations, and it will be returned the minute they can do it.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Let's dive into that a little bit. So essentially what he's saying is that it's not just wealthy individuals that have been able to sit on some of their money. Some of the companies that have not been heavily impacted were still able to collect this business support, even if they didn't necessarily need it because they weren't impacted as heavily by the pandemic. So they could take these business loans like CEBA, that was a $40,000 loan, collect the loan and just sort of sit on it and hold it just in case things got worse for them. And then when the time comes for them to repay it, when they repay that loan, they're only required to pay back $30,000 of it. So even businesses that didn't necessarily see a loss of income could be collecting $10,000 of essentially free stimulus money from the government, even if they weren't heavily impacted in their day-to-day running of the business. So instead of taking that $40,000 and making it work to maybe hire more employees or invest back in the business to make it more pandemic proof, some businesses have just taken this money, kept it in their checkings account, maybe earned a little bit of interest on it while it sat there, and just planned to give it right back and collect the $10,000. So this is in stark contrast to what we're seeing in the more local businesses and the mom and pop shops. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a walk down your downtown, wherever you live. I'm thinking that no matter where you are, you're going to see a lot of businesses that have been forced to shut down because even though they were able to collect this money, their industry, maybe it was a retail or a restaurant, was more heavily hit. And even though they got the same benefits, they weren't able to survive. Whereas these other companies that may be entirely not affected by the pandemic or even profiting more from it, were able to receive those loans and just use them as insurance, maybe make a little bit of money off of it.
Which raises on both fronts this question about whether we are, and I understand it would have been hard to do in the beginning, speed was of the essence, but whether our governments are doing a good enough job now, Benny, of clawing back and making sure that that people aren't the beneficiaries of income, and even maybe thinking about taxation differently right now for the people that are actually benefiting from this pandemic. They're not massive in number, but there are some people who are better off in this pandemic than they were before.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we all know that, and the question is what to do about it. And I think that the government knows that. They know that all those programs are full of holes, but taxing them now will be so complicated. You have to wait until they feel their taxes and then see what's happening and what can be done. So I suspect that this is really not going to happen anytime soon. The government is not in the mood to go after people at this point. I think they will do it after the tax year is coming to an end, and then they will see what makes sense and what doesn't.
Okay. So they're saying
Benjamin
that
Tal.
there could even not be consequences for this until way farther down the line. So you know what? I think there are a lot of interesting insights in that interview as to what's really happening and why we're seeing this huge spike in savings, both for Canadian businesses and Canadian individuals. Even though we're seeing these spike in numbers, it seems like there's a large disparity between the people who are benefiting from the pandemic, or at least are doing decently well, and the people who are definitely not, right? We're seeing the wealthier Canadians maybe make a little bit of money over the time. I know that if you've invested in the stock market, you've likely seen a lot of gains lately, whereas the people who are struggling to make ends meet and are really needing these benefits and are taking them and using them and funneling them back into the economy, they're still in a worse financial position than they were even before. So even though we're seeing this spike, it's not the reality for the low-income Canadians who are struggling the most. It's more a reflection and an overrepresentation of the families who were already decently well off, continuing to remain in that position or even improve it. Which of course makes me curious about what you have to say about all this. Now, the current system doesn't seem the most fair, does it? But what do you think is the problem with it? Who do you think is at fault, right? Is it the government and the way they've crafted their policies so that these kind of businesses and these already wealthy individuals will be able to take a little bit of money? Or do you think that that's fair game and that it was more important to just get money out at the beginning than really monitoring what would happen with that money? Let me know down in the comments. I'm really interested on your opinion on this because we've seen the CEBA, which is that business loan that he was talking about in the interview, that was actually expanded recently and increased to $60,000. So we're likely going to see even more businesses taking this loan and just holding it and sort of using it as a security net for their business in case things get bad, even if they're not struggling right now. There's going to be a lot of opinions on this, and I like to read all the comments that I get, and I reply to most of them, especially if they're in the first hour that I post the video. So let me know what you think about all this down there. And if you've made it this far in the video, it's clear that you're interested in this stuff and that you think it's a very important thing for us to be talking about as a society as we move forward in this recovery from the pandemic in the future. So if you think that this is interesting, let's keep the conversation going. Hit that share button down there, that's the arrow, and send this to a person that you think could benefit from thinking about this a little bit more. I personally think that that's the best way to make anything like this change for the better, right? We need to keep talking about it with as many people as possible so that it gets on the radar of more and more people. And of course, if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. I'm bringing updates just like this whenever there's anything that could change the way that Canadians use and utilize and save and invest their money. So if you want to be constantly updated about that sort of stuff to help yourself live a more wealthy future, make sure to hit all those good buttons down there. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out or at least made you think a little bit, and I'll see you next time.